Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to join Senator Capito and our colleagues and welcome everyone to our hearing this morning. Especially want to let the Secretary know how grateful we are that you worked us into your schedule. I know you had a lot of demands on your time, and we're really pleased that you could be with us this morning for us to hear from you and for you to hear from us as well. But grateful, trying to do your job on the heels of an infrastructure package that's monumental, trying to raise a young family. You're a busy man, so welcome. Now to the topic of today's hearing, that's the implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This law represents the single largest investment in our nation's history with respect to our roads and bridges. I think since the construction of the interstate highway system, almost 3/4 of a century ago. This is an historic win for the American people in red states and blue states and throughout the United States. As we discuss this bipartisan success story, I think it's important to acknowledge the significant role that our committee played in drafting this legislation. Last May, after months of hard work, our committee unanimously reported out Service Transportation Reauthorization Bill by a vote of 20-0. But before that happened, some of you know that a new president just went into office, asked me to pull together a small group of Democrats and Republicans off this committee to discuss the need for infrastructure legislation, roads, highways, bridges, as well as water, wastewater, flood control. And it turned out a week or so after that, Senator Capito, Senator Gordon, Senator Inhofe, and I joined the president, and you joined us remotely, Mr. Secretary. Kamala Harris, our vice president, was there in person. And the president called for us to, as a committee that is known to work together on legislation, to actually try to enact a bipartisan legislation that focused on infrastructure. And that's what we set to work to do. Senator Inhofe is not here with us today. He's back home with his wife, Kay, and we're thinking of them today. And he's, I think, the longest-serving current member of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I think he joined this committee back in 1995, and right in the middle of my first term as governor. He served as our chairman from 2003 to 06, and was a ranking member, I think, from 07 to 13. And someone that we look to for leadership on these issues, and we're sending our best to him and his wife Kay today. Now to the topic of today's hearing: implementation of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. As we discuss this success story, I think it's important to acknowledge the significant role that our committee played in drafting that legislation. We passed unanimously out of this committee legislation on service transportation. We did that beating, I think, the deadline that the president set for us by a month or so. Reported out unanimously 20-0. After we reported out unanimously 20-0 water infrastructure legislation. Our bills went on to serve as a foundation for what would become a broader bipartisan infrastructure package. And Senator Capito then became before he had a gang of 20 or a gang of 19, we had a gang of 1. And she and the president spent days together, weeks together, trying hard to hammer out bipartisan compromise, which really laid the groundwork for what would actually become the legislation that we passed in the Senate, passed in the House, and the president signed into law. Senator Capito and I had the privilege of managing that historic package on the Senate floor, and we stood together on the White House lawn that cold day in November when President Biden signed it into law. I thought it was so cool. They will just say, the president is here, walks out of the White House, and he's standing at the podium to address about 1,000 or so of us on the White House lawn. And 3 of us, Senator Capito, Senator Manchin, and I, 3 West Virginia kids who ended up having to craft the legislation and manage it on the floor, were there with the president when he signed it into law. It was a very special day. As we drafted and negotiated a bill, I had several top priorities in mind. They included enhancing the sustainability and resilience of our transportation systems, improving safety, especially for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as addressing the backlog of repairs for roads and bridges in poor condition throughout our nation. And that's why I'm pleased to see this administration encouraging states to use federal highway funds to prioritize these same goals. Notice they said encourage. I'm going to underline that. Encourage, not require. And as an old governor, as a recovering governor, I never liked for the federal government to require us to do a lot of stuff. But encouragement, we're always ready to listen to that. But there is an important distinction that we need to, I think, make today. To me, advancing these goals is common sense, and as it turns out, many states agree. The American Association of State Highways and Transportation officials, whom Senator Capito and I addressed earlier today, declared that states very much share the administration's priorities of addressing climate change, safety, and roadway maintenance, and this should not come as a surprise. We know that the transportation sector accounts for the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our economy. Something like 30% of carbon dioxide emissions are cars, trucks, vans. About 28% comes from our power plants. Another 25% or so comes from our manufacturing operations, cement plants, steel mills, and that sort of thing. But meeting our shared climate goals also requires us to prioritize projects that reduce emissions and boost resilience. That's why we included in the first ever climate title as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. In addition to our $18 billion climate title, we also secured $5 billion to build a national electric vehicle charging network, as well as funding to purchase electric transit and school buses, too. And when we look at the need to address safety on our roads, the data is pretty clear, and it provides a clear, yet I think alarming picture. First 9 months of 2021, U.S. traffic deaths rose to the highest number since 2006, with fatalities of pedestrians and bicyclists at a 30-year high. Let me say that again, at a 30-year high. To reverse this troubling trend, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law makes significant investments in roadway safety, especially for our more vulnerable road users. Bike lanes and sidewalks not only benefit the safety of people who use them, but also are good for our health, our economy, and our planet. Encouraging agencies to build them is a win-win, and I applaud the administration for emphasizing safety for all road users as part of its national roadway safety strategy. As a runner who runs, I know our leader, our witness here today, does a little running, and is an old Navy guy. Like, he stays in shape, but as a runner, and it's a son who's going to be ride a bike from San Francisco to L.A. Later this year to raise some money for a good cause. This is personally important to our family. But third point I want to make is when we look at fixing what's broken, we get to what makes infrastructure personal for many families. Americans feel the impact of our crumbling roads, our bridges, every day when they commute to work or they go to school. And most agree that we should encourage states to fix and maintain our roads and bridges that are in poor condition. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law largely maintains the existing, and this is an important point, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that we've passed largely maintains the existing structure of state and local decision-making and the process for distributing highway funding by formula to states. However, the law also contains an unprecedented increase in funding for our nation's service transportation programs. The sheer size of this funding leads no question in my mind that state and local agencies can both redouble their efforts to repair our roads, highways, and bridges, and begin to address safety, sustainability, resilience, and other local priorities. We have an opportunity, as I like to say, to walk and chew gum at the same time. Let's do both. In closing, before I turn to Senator Capito, let me just say I hope we can all take this opportunity today to celebrate our transformational bipartisan accomplishment. Too often Americans see their elected leaders in Washington picking partisan battles that don't achieve tangible results. But by enacting this once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure, our roads, our highways, our bridges, our water, our drinking water, wastewater, flood control, we've demonstrated that bipartisanship is not only possible, it's essential. This new law is already beginning to grow our economy, creating a ton of additional good-paying jobs, and make a positive impact on a whole lot of lives. It's a major win for which all of us can be proud and should be proud, and I am, and I know that other members of this committee are as well. That being said, implementation is critical. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the work ahead of us, you and your team, is immense. We know that you are focused on ensuring that the American people experience the benefits of the new laws quickly as possible. We look forward to hearing your testimony today on the department's critical work in putting this money to work for communities across our country. Before we do that, let me recognize our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening remarks, and again, thank her and her team for being vital partners in getting this law enacted, and also thank her for showing the way and being, before there was a gang of 19, a gang of one.
Oh. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. I think this is going to be a great hearing, and I thank the Chairman for his ongoing commitment to bipartisan oversight of the implementation of the IIJA. I'm proud to say, as he has said, that the foundation of the IIJA consists of two of our committee's bipartisan products, which were unanimous coming out of this committee: the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act of 2021 and the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act of 2021. This historic legislation, I think, proved once again that we can come together to develop bills that tackle our nation's pressing challenges in a manner that reflects input from both of our parties and a diverse stakeholder community. I will say, in the week that I was home last week, we were already starting to see the benefits and the excitement from counties and cities and regional areas who are going to be able to really make a difference in a lot of people's lives. I also want to thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for joining us today, as well as the staff at the Department of Transportation for their tireless work to implement the IIJA, and also for their work in formulating many of these projects that are in our visions that are contained within. As we look at the status of the implementation, it's important to acknowledge that the department is constrained in its efforts by operating under the current continuing resolution. Senators on this committee, including myself, have urged our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee — I guess I'm urging myself because I'm on that committee as well — to take action to ensure that the IIJA be fully implemented as quickly as possible. Hopefully next week we will have some resolution, whether through enactment of a final fiscal year 2022 legislative appropriations or providing anomalies so that the state can take advantage of the new levels of formula funding. Implementation is further compounded, I think, by the still vacant position of the Administrator of the Federal Highways, the FHWA. I've repeatedly said in this committee that a Senate-confirmed administrator is critical to ensuring timely and effective implementation. It would certainly help the Secretary as well. Chairman Carper and I sent a letter to the White House on this matter earlier this year, and I look forward to considering a qualified nomination for this position. As the committee was developing the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, and the Chairman outlined many of those provisions, I came to the table with several major policy and funding priorities, and I'm proud to see that many of them are reflected in the final project. I'd like to take a minute to highlight a few of my priorities. The IIJA provides significant funding levels, $303.5 billion, out of the Highway Trust Fund over 5 years for federal highway programs. 90% of that funding is being distributed by formula, giving states the much-needed certainty to plan and carry out projects to address their unique surface transportation needs. My home state of West Virginia will receive over $3 billion. This legislation also created a $2 billion rural surface transportation grant program that includes dedicated resources for the Appalachian Development Highway System, the ADHS, and other critical projects across West Virginia. This dedicated funding is critical to completing the ADHS, in particular Corridor H in West Virginia, where I just visited last week, which will connect the eastern and central parts of our state with the Metro DC area and open up more opportunities for economic growth and tourism. The IIJA also includes numerous project delivery provisions, including environmental review and permitting reforms for highway and bridge projects. Notably, it codifies one federal decision, which requires agencies to coordinate on a predictable joint schedule and sets a 2-year goal for completing the environmental review and permitting process for major projects, which we heard could take previously between 7 to 10 years. The IIJA also includes a number of policy and funding wins for my colleagues across both the aisle and up and down the dais. All of these priorities were addressed in a bipartisan manner through thoughtful negotiation. Nobody got everything they wanted. Some priorities were considered and intentionally excluded over the course of the negotiations. On December 16th, the FHWA issued a memorandum to staff entitled Policy on Using Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Resources to Build a Better America, which I found troubling. The memorandum provides an overarching policy framework to guide the use of funding in the IIJA in a manner that reflects the policy priorities of the Biden administration. A number of these policies run contrary to the compromises that this committee made when negotiating the Surface Transportation Reauthorizing Act and seeing it through its enactment. Specifically, the memorandum seeks to restrict the flexibility of states and impose a one-size-fits-all solution to address the surface transportation needs of all communities. It discourages states from moving forward with projects that add highway capacity and instead prioritizes projects that improve existing surface transportation assets. The memorandum also, in my view, creates winners and losers among different types of projects based on their level of environmental review required by NEPA. Attempts to direct funding to assets not owned and operated by states' DOTs, and it focuses on projects that advance the administration's priorities, regardless of whether these projects meaningfully address the needs of a particular state or community. In response to this memorandum, I promptly met with Deputy Administrator Pollack to express my concerns, and I expressed them to you yesterday over the phone. Since then, numerous senators and on both sides of the aisle and the stakeholders have raised a similar alarm about this memorandum. Approximately 2 weeks ago, my colleagues and I, including every Republican on this committee, sent the Secretary a letter requesting that this memorandum be rescinded or substantially revised to demonstrate that the FHWA intends to implement the IIJA as enacted. I look forward to hearing from the Secretary on these and other important matters, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator Capito. I'm just going to mention a couple of things about our Secretary today. I didn't realize that, but he's a Rhodes Scholar. And I said to my staff, do you spell it R-O-A-D-S or R-H-O-D-E-S? And they said, well, it could be either one. Pretty good. And I asked, did he ever spend any time in uniform? And they said, in fact, he was in the Navy. And as one Navy guy to another, thank you for that service. And I spent some time in Southeast Asia during a big war. And our witness today has spent some time in uniform in Afghanistan during the conflict there when we had a major presence. He's served as a mayor of South Bend, and which is, how many people live in South Bend these days? How many? A couple of 100,000? What is it?
About 100,000, yeah.
And Jim Inhofe, who's not with us today, as I said earlier, is a former mayor of Tulsa. So we have people here who have been former governors and mayors, and so you ought to feel very much at home. And we're delighted that you're our secretary, and very much appreciate the opportunity. The other thing I would say about our witness today is he's surrounded himself with excellent people, and in his previous roles, but also here in his role as secretary, because he stole about half my staff, and most of them were named Andrew, and I think a couple of them are here. We're going to keep them until we get everything we want from you and your department. No, just kidding. You got some really good people, and you know that. So with that, your testimony will be made part of the record, and you're now recognized. Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Secretary. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Department of Transportation's ongoing work to implement President Biden's historic bipartisan infrastructure law. And I'd like to begin by thanking you for everything you did to craft and to pass this urgently needed piece of legislation. It's a landmark that we believe will stand to the credit of this Congress and this administration alike. As members of the committee know well, America's infrastructure fell into a state of disrepair for decades, and the American people rightly demanded action. We had yet another blunt reminder of the urgency and need just last month in Pittsburgh with the collapse of the Fern Hollow Bridge. As I've traveled across the country, I have seen supply chains straining, bridges out of service, and critical infrastructure destroyed by increasingly frequent climate disasters. The need for major investment has long been clear, and now this president and this Congress have delivered the means to address that need. Through this law, we're now in the early stages of a generational modernization of our infrastructure that will serve to bolster our economic security and prosperity for decades to come. The investments now underway will strengthen our goods movement and supply chains, reduce costs for American consumers, make it easier and safer for people to get to where they need to be, help tackle the climate crisis, and create good-paying jobs building bridges, paving roads, electrifying buses, installing EV chargers, laying track, and so much more. At DOT, we're working to implement these investments according to the new law, with a focus on making our nation's roads safer, making our transportation systems cleaner, more accessible, and more resilient to climate impacts, and enabling all Americans to share in the benefits equitably. We began our work as soon as the President signed the new law. In the past 90 days, we have already put forward a total of $60 billion in authorized funding to states and communities, and we've opened applications for another $2 billion in discretionary grant programs. Our Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, announced the largest annual apportionment of highway funds in decades. More than $52 billion for states to repair and rebuild our roads, bridges, and highways, making them safer and more resilient. With regard to federal aid highway funding, I want to pause and emphasize the importance of the relationship between our department and our state partners, because I know that's been of particular interest to members of this committee. I want to make clear that we recognize and value the role of the states in deciding how to prioritize the use of formula dollars as laid out in the law. Different states and communities have different needs when it comes to transportation assets that have to be reconfigured and modernized, expanded and added, or retired and replaced as appropriate. And we look forward to our continued support of state transportation departments as they undertake this work. And I am proud to affirm the virtues of what so many states, from Alabama to Virginia to my home state of Indiana and many more, have been doing to focus on repairing the vital infrastructure we already have. That philosophy is something we at DOT share with state leaders across the country, Republicans and Democrats alike, who are working to repair, maintain, and modernize the roads, bridges, and other transportation infrastructure that their residents count on every day. Maintaining and improving our existing infrastructure is critical to building a better, cleaner, more modern transportation system. And now we can bring new resources and energy to this work. FHWA recently launched our new Bridge Formula program, single largest dedicated bridge investment since the creation of the interstate highway system, with more than $26 billion to repair and replace our bridges so we can avoid devastating collapses and closures like the one we saw recently. We've established a joint Office of Energy and Transportation with the Department of Energy, followed by our announcement of $5 billion in support for states as they draw up plans to build out what will become a national network of EV chargers, 500,000 strong by 2030. We've opened applications for some of our most significant grant programs with more funding than ever, thanks to the infrastructure law, including our RAISE, Port Infrastructure Development Program, and Airport Terminal Program, with more soon to come. We're working closely with state departments of transportation and other project sponsors to ensure they have the flexibility and support they need to deploy all these funds in ways that make sense for their communities while ensuring the expenditure of these funds meets our shared public policy goals and the high standards for the use of federal taxpayer dollars. All of us work to enact the infrastructure law for the same reason, because we know it will do so much to make life better for the American people. It will improve everyday life for the traveling public and anyone who counts on our supply chains. It will ease daily commutes and long-haul travel alike, and it will create jobs. We at the DOT look forward to continuing our work with all of you to bring the ambitious vision of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to life across our country. I want to thank you again for inviting me to be here today, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for that opening statement. Let me just start off with a couple of questions, and I'll yield to Senator Capito. There's been some confusion. I think you've addressed it in your opening statement. I'm delighted you have. But some confusion about a guidance document that the Federal Highway Administration issued, I think, a couple of months ago, maybe back in December. But just for further clarification, does the memo tie the hands of states or prevent states from selecting projects to fund using their federal highway formula dollars, including adding highway capacity if they choose to do so?
No, it doesn't.
All right. And second, can you tell us any more about why the department has encouraged states to consider prioritizing projects to address safety, to address road and bridge construction and emissions? Why?
Well, we view these as common sense and longstanding policy goals, and goals that we share with so many of the state transportation leaders we speak to. So under the law, and as we seek to implement it, of course, states decide what projects to build with their federal formula funds. We believe that thoughtful road investments are vital to achieving those safety, equity, and climate goals. Notably, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, AASHTO, which represents the state transportation departments and which I know you've been in touch with even this week as they gather, wrote about how states very much share FHWA's policy priorities outlined in this guidance. The states are making these investments not because of any ideological tilt one way or the other, but because they are often more affordable in the short term, more cost-effective in the medium term, and yield better outcomes for travelers and for movement of goods and for communities in the long term. So what we're really seeking to do is work with states on the investments that are going to create the most bang for that federal taxpayer buck, while recognizing, of course, that context matters and that what is appropriate in one community or state will be different than what's appropriate in another.
As Senator Capito knows, and some of our colleagues know as well, I ended up moving to Delaware when I got out of the Navy at the end of the Vietnam War, and had the opportunity to ultimately serve the people there in a lot of different ways. The foundation of my service to Delaware and really to the country came from a conversation that we had around our dinner table when my sister and I were just little kids. And my mom and dad had gone to Shady Springs High School, which Senator Capito knows, just outside of Beckley, West Virginia. And one night after supper, my dad said to my sister and me, when we were very young, he said, "Your mom and I want you to go to college." He said, "Your mom and I want you to go to college." And we said, "Well, we want to go to college, Dad." And he said, "And we want you to figure out how to pay for it. We want you to figure out how to pay for it." My father, who never went beyond high school, he's a World War II veteran, GI Bill, learned how to fix wrecked cars, Burleson Oldsmobile in Beckley, West Virginia. And there was a couple things he used to say to us a lot. And you can probably remember things that your parents said to you, and I'm sure everybody in this committee, that have been sort of guidelines for our lives. But one of the other things that my dad would say a lot to us is that my sister and I would do some kind of boneheaded stunt, and my father would always say, "Just use some common sense. Just use some common." He didn't say it so nicely, but he said it a lot. We must not have had much. But that's some of the best advice I've ever gotten. And I listened to your statement and the response that you had to my first question. It reminds me of really my father and the use of common sense. And I'm glad to see that you're following, I think, his advice, and I hope I still am as well. Next, I want to turn to the rollout of climate formula programs. And we know that the continuing resolution has had an impact on U.S. DOT's ability to move forward with some of the new programs created in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. My colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, some of whom are here today, are hard at work, and I hope Congress will soon pass an omnibus appropriation bill to fund the government for the rest of this fiscal year through the end of September. Once the appropriations bill is enacted, how quickly will the Department of Transportation be able to apportion the new carbon reduction and protect formula programs and provide the guidance necessary for the states to start utilizing those funds?
Well, both of these programs are so important for not only the development toward our climate goals, but the protection of our infrastructure assets with regard to resilience imperatives. And so we will get to work as soon as we are able to, thanks to that appropriation that we seek. We're doing everything that we can, of course, within the constraints that currently exist, but I appreciate you and the ranking member both mentioning the sense of urgency that we have about seeing that appropriation come through that will allow us to go full speed ahead.
Great. Time is wasting. All right, Senator Capito, please.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I appreciate many of the sentiments that you've expressed today, but I want to go back to the memo. And I know that you and I have talked about it, and I heard your response to the chairman. But we debated these policies in this committee. We debated them with the House and the Senate as each chamber developed its respective proposals to reauthorize these federal surface transportation programs. These policies were ultimately rejected and not included in the final legislation sent to the president's desk. So let me give you a specific example, and I believe you have it there because there's no way you can read it from there.
Appreciate it.
House Chairman Peter DeFazio's Invest in America Act included language that restricted the ability of a state to carry out a project that added new capacity for single occupancy passenger vehicles. His language is shown on this one over here. You can see it's got some highlighted areas. The FHWA memo directs FHWA staff to encourage state departments of transportation and other entities to consider certain factors before advancing projects that result in new capacity for single occupancy vehicles. The language from this memo is shown in this other poster here. As you can see, this language from the memo is lifted from the bill that DeFazio had that was sent over here to the Senate as the shell bill that we rejected here in the United States Senate. The Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, which passed this committee, had no such language in there. I've said many times this is a bipartisan bill, it's a product of careful negotiations that reflected the will of the committee unanimously. You sent me a letter earlier that said, in response to what bringing this to your attention, and your memorandum said that it's consistent with the bipartisan infrastructure language. And I just don't think it's consistent, and I'm really troubled that a memo coming from your department has language in it that was rejected from the House bill, basically verbatim. So I guess, what's your reaction to that?
So I guess I would say my understanding is what was rejected was the mandate with regard to these goals, not the idea of these goals. So as I look down the text, for example, the first one I see is progress in achieving a state of good repair consistent with the state's asset management plan. Now, I cannot imagine that anyone here rejects the proposition that it's a good thing to have progress in achieving a state of good repair consistent with the state's asset management plan. What I do recognize is that there was a move in the House to say that unless you'd shown that progress, you couldn't even go forward on some of that new construction. And if that were to have prevailed, then of course my department would be responsible for implementing that law. But that's not what the law says that you passed, of course. The law does not say that you have to prove that you've made that progress on a state of good repair in order to do anything else. But I would be perplexed by any suggestion that we should no longer believe that a state of good repair is a good thing. If I were to go to the next bullet, and I think that I'm just seeing this here, but I think it's the same that's on the board, and I appreciate your providing it for me because it is a bit of an eye chart from where I sit. There's a reference to how the project will support the achievement of the state's performance targets. So again, as I understand the progress of the bill, the Senate did not go forward with a requirement saying the state has to meet its performance targets in order to be allowed to do new construction. And so as we go forward implementing the law, we would not impose any such mandate. But of course, we still believe it's a good thing for a state to achieve its performance targets. If I go to the third one, it says whether the project is more cost effective than both operational improvements to the facility or corridor and transit projects eligible under Chapter 53, Title 49. So my understanding is, had the House bill passed, we would have been required under the law to certify that in some way in order to allow that funding to go forward. But of course, that's not what passed, as you point out. And so there is no such requirement. But of course, cost effectiveness continues to be something that we would consider to be important and would support states in achieving. So to me, the difference, of course, is that mandate. And my understanding is, and our understanding as we go forward, implementing the law as written, is it has no such mandate, and that's why the memo says that there's no such requirement.
So from your explanation, would I assume that the fact that they're verbatim from the DeFazio bill into the memo that came from your department, word for word, is just because?
Well, it's because they're good ideas. It's just that the law doesn't mandate them, so neither will we.
So are you in the habit of lifting language from unpassed bills and putting it into regulations that you put forward that obviously had been negotiated out of bills?
Well, again, our understanding was that what was negotiated out was not the idea of cost effectiveness, but the mandate. So as we seek to implement the bill as written, you'll continue to see phrases like state of good repair that I trust have been on the lips of secretaries, Republican and Democrat alike, and members of both parties in both chambers. But the law as written does not provide.
Basically saying, yes, these things are important. These things are things that we as states formulate. It's different for Maryland than it is for me or Delaware or North Dakota. So let us keep the flexibility of moving forward on safety and repair. This is what state DOTs do. They keep their roads as much as they can in good state repair. That's what they're doing now and have done. But now we have an opportunity with a bipartisan infrastructure package to really build more where areas that need that. And in your memo, you say more capacity, but there's a big but in there. You have to consider all these other things. You should consider all these other things. If you look further into the AASHTO letter, since you brought it up, some of the quotes are, while the legislative process that led to the IIJA was certainly unconventional, and the congressional intent regarding the federal highway program over the next 5 years provides state DOTs with flexibility in how investment decisions are made with formula to meet each state's unique mobility and accessibility needs. Proposals to require fix-it-first solutions or prescribe the use of certain sources of funding for system preservation do not reflect the use of strategic planning, but rather a one-size-fits-all approach to asset management. So this is part of the letter that you're quoting from as well, as they deviate from what they see is a directive from the department to do it one way, this way, if you want to have favorable or at least move higher up into the priorities. So what kind of reaction would you have to that?
Well, I think that the states are rightly saying that they share these same goals that we're talking about, the kinds of goals reflected in these bullets, for example, but they want the flexibility to be able to do it based on their strategy, based on their approach, and based on their needs. And we support that flexibility. In implementing the law as written, we are to provide the flexibility that's written into the law, and of course the accountability that's written into the law for the standards that apply to the use of federal taxpayer dollars. And that's what we will seek to do.
Yeah, and I would say there's confusion here. There's confusion from the stakeholders. There's confusion from the state DOTs because they said, they are expressing concern in the letter they said back to you. I'm going to move on to one more thing before I give up my questioning. I think I'm over my time. Maybe I should wait and let the other members question. I wanted to ask about the one federal decision.
Sure.
Quickly, I want to know, how are you implementing this? What steps have been taken? What kind of conversations are you having between all the different agencies?
So I'll give you the most compact answer that I can, which is that we're working hard to implement that, in particular noting the expectation of steps consistent with the 2-year agency average in clearing those projects that are major, that have that environmental impact statement attached to them. We'd be happy to follow up about with more detail on the progress, but we take that.
Do you have a timeline for implementing this?
Well, it's already now, we work toward that goal right now. In terms of when we'll be able to have sort of the dashboard up and see how we're tracking toward that goal, I hope to be making progress right away.
Okay, thank you.
Before we turn to Senator Cardin for the next round of questioning, I want to make a unanimous consent to request relating to concerns expressed by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle as to whether the U.S. Department of Transportation is creating a new goal of maintaining highway assets that's not consistent with past practice or statute. And I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a guidance document from 2004, released by the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, which makes a very similar points with respect to 2021 guidance. The Bush administration encouraged their staff to promote highway repair and to work with state DOTs to preserve existing highway assets. I'd further like to submit for the record the text of Section 150, Title 23 U.S. Code. This highway law passed by Congress in 2012 established the state of good repair as a national goal. I believe these documents show that the recent guidance builds on longstanding law and policy to encourage states to maintain existing assets. And with that having been said, let me turn to Senator Cardin. I want to say to Senator Cardin, who chairs the subcommittee on infrastructure on this committee, thank you for your continued leadership, both in this committee, in the Senate, and the work that preceded it for many years in the House of Representatives, and before that as Speaker of the House for the state of Maryland. What a life, what a career. It's an honor to be your wingman here, and to sit next to you last night during that speech.
Mr. Chairman, you have a way of introducing people. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Did I miss anything?
Yes, you missed
Married
a lot.
up.
That's fine.
Married up.
Thank you. We appreciate your view of history, your own personal examples in your life, how it's formed your priorities. But most importantly, I think I speak for every member of this committee, we appreciate your respect for every single member of this committee and bringing us together to have the type of civility to deal with difficult issues where we have different views, but to be able to move forward in a very positive way. And that was very clear with the legislation that Senator Capito referred to, two pieces passing this committee, and the bipartisan infrastructure package, which basically incorporates the work of this committee. So we thank you very much. And Senator Capito, I always enjoy working with you. I have a different view as to your point in regards to the letter issued by the Department of Transportation. I do think we always want to find the right balance. The balance between giving flexibility to the states, which are determinative to the priorities that are important for their community, but also to advance priorities, national priorities. As Chairman Carper pointed out, we put that in law. I mean, the balance between maintaining our infrastructure and increasing capacity is one in which we have an interest at the national level to make sure it is attended to and that we have oversight as to how the transportation programs of this country are balancing those two very important issues. That's our responsibility. And as we negotiated this bill, many of us had very strong priorities in regards to transportation safety, in regards to equity, in regards to maintenance, in regards to resiliency, in regards to climate change. And we were able to work out the implementing legislation so that we could get unanimity in our committee, but to advance those priorities. So yes, Mr. Secretary, we want to maintain flexibility, but we also want to advance national priorities. And I think the way that you have explained your letter, I agree with completely. So we have 90% of the funds go by formula programs. We've talked about that. Some of the formula programs deal directly with safety. Some of them deal directly with air quality. So we have programs that we have advanced the funding in because that's our priorities also. So I think it is absolutely consistent for you to look at the overall plans of the states to see whether it's carrying out what Congress in a strong vote asked you in implementing the bipartisan infrastructure package. I could go through a lot of the specifics. You know, we were directly engaged in equity. We haven't talked about that, but I mention that because in my community, we have a highway to nowhere that was built in downtown Baltimore that very much negatively impacted on the residential communities. And they were not politically active enough to stop that at the time. And now we have an opportunity by reconnecting communities that we can use the bipartisan infrastructure package to deal with a need of a community because of a transportation project that never should have been built in the first place and certainly did not tend to the community when it was built. That's an example of how we came together, and we specifically spoke to that. And I encourage you as to how you implement that. And then we talked a little bit before the hearing started about the bicycle lanes, et cetera. Well, we have Transportation Alternative Program. That was initiated by us, bipartisan. Senator Cochran and I initiated the Transportation Alternative Programs. Now Senator Wicker is my partner on that. And we provided substantially more funds for the Transportation Alternative Program, increasing it from $850 million to $1.4 billion. So my point is that the issues that are in the letter that's referred to by Senator Capito are priorities that we have come together as a committee to pay attention to, and it's only reasonable that you would look at the overall plans of the states as to how they're dealing with the priorities that Congress has been advancing now for many of our surface transportation bills. I want to ask you, we have these new programs to deal with reconnecting communities. I just want, if you want to give us quickly a status, but I would also like to get to one other question during my time, and that is there was an announcement made to increase the contracting goals for small disadvantaged businesses. I serve as chair of the Small Business Committee, and we've been laser focused in trying to help small businesses. I see the infrastructure bill as a major tool to help America's small businesses, but it's also an opportunity to help those small disadvantaged businesses, not just in subcontracts. I hope you'll also take a look at prime contracts. And if you could share with us how you intend to implement that, I would appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. We strongly agree that there's an enormous opportunity with the public dollars that are going to be spent to improve infrastructure around the country, to create jobs and to create generational wealth with work that can be done by underserved and I would say underestimated businesses and those who have been overlooked in the past. So we're being very intentional about that, like many agencies in procurement. But as you know, the vast majority of the dollars that go through our department aren't things that we directly procure. They go out through our grants and our discretionary programs. And so it's with a view to that we're going to work not only to ensure that there are ambitious goals set, but to take some responsibility for building the capacity in the first place, because we know that navigating those processes can be daunting for small businesses that haven't sought federal work before. And like you, I strongly believe that we need to see more disadvantaged businesses get to that prime role, while also working with the largest primes that are there right now to ask them what they're doing to ensure that some of their subcontracting goes to DBs that have overlooked. But we want to make sure that we're doing both, and that'll continue to be a very important focus for us.
And could I ask that you keep us informed, as well as the Small Business Committee informed, as to how you're implementing that goal? It's a major increase in percent, which is great, and it increases over time, which is also the smart way to do it. If you could keep us informed, our committees, I would very much appreciate that. And then lastly, in regards to implementing the reconnecting communities, appreciate as that gets rolled out, that we get as much of the information so that we can get it to our communities in order to try to take advantage of these opportunities. I would appreciate that.
Certainly will. On reconnecting communities, I must note it is one of those new starts that is waiting for us to move out of that continuing resolution environment, but we will lay as much groundwork for it now as the law permits, while looking forward to being able to move fully forward ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cardin, thank you for those questions and for your kind words. Senator Kramer, you're next. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think you guys might know each other. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I was pleased to support the Secretary was because he came from in North Dakota, a large town, but another famously a smaller community in rural America, and would understand the importance of federalism and the importance of of a partnership where the federal government yields to the local and state governments as opposed to the other way around. That said, I want to add my appreciation to you, Mr. Chairman, of course, to Ranking Member Capito. I have a saying, Mr. Secretary, that if you want to get big things done, you call on the firm of Carper, Capito, Cardin, and Kramer, and we'll get it put together. But anyway, thank you. But I do want to dig in on the federalism point a little bit and the memorandum, because it did create not just some confusion, but concern by people out there who are going, wait a minute, we were told that these smart people, simplified the process, and yet we're getting this sort of complicating language. And I think with regard to the exact language that we specifically excluded from the bill to see it turn up in even a memorandum or guidance as opposed to, specific regulation, it almost appears designed to create some of that confusion. I hope that's not the case, but that's how it was taken. And when I listened to you describe to Senator Capito, I guess explained why it appears, it sounded to me a little bit like you were arguing against the spirit of the law by using the letter of the law. And that adds confusion, because we were very specific. And I want to get specifically to the issue of the single agency or the one agency rule, which we codified. And you said, well, you're working to, in one of the questions, or one of the answers, you said, we're working to implement it. And what causes me to chuckle there is, don't get me wrong, you have a big job, and it's not as simple as I'd like it to be, but it's not as complicated as the bureaucracy likes it to be either. The whole point of one agency is to simplify, to make it easy to implement, right? So let me ask you a specific question about funding. Does this guidance imply, whether intentionally or unintentionally, imply a set of priorities that will be used as guidance in the decision of the agency when it comes to, say, awarding grants or some other funding? And you can answer the broader question in the context of that specific one if you'd like.
Sure. So what I'd say is it certainly reflects our priorities, and when it comes to discretionary grants, for example, as provided for within the law, some of the things we've talked about: safety, state of good repair, economic strength, resilience. These are national priorities, administration priorities, and things that will certainly guide me within the parameters of the law in our decisions and our approach to the competitive grants. With regard to the formulas, again, ultimately the states are making these calls, right? And we recognize that and support that. We also, of course, want to help them get to places where they might not even have known some of the flexibilities that exist. And I'll give you an example that ties back to what Senator Cardin was raising with transportation alternatives, right? There are a number of authorities and flexibilities within the Surface Transportation Block Grant that I think many states would like to take advantage of, but it might be helpful for us to remind them that they have access to that, because that's evolved over time. But ultimately, the left and right boundaries here are the letter of the law. That's all that I can work with in deciding what to do in implementing these formula programs. With regard to the one federal decision, having been a local leader and waded through these processes, let me just restate my commitment to making sure that administrative inefficiency is never accepted as a reason for any of those processes to take longer than they could. And if we can beat those targets, that's even better.
Well, especially, I think, thank you for that. I think in this era of pretty hyperinflation, where the supply side of the economic formula has been shorted, let's get after it real quickly, and I appreciate your commitment to that. And we need to do our part as well in passing appropriations. I know we're all committed to that. Please tell me we're going to get that done. But I'll just end with this. Federalism really does work, and the absence of prohibition is not a license to do whatever the bureaucracy wants. And I think that's how it appears to some people. I hope that your clarification is comfort, because my advice to my governor and to my state, and frankly the 5-state coalition of the North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho that work together on these policies, it's a really big footprint out there. My advice to them is to ignore, frankly, the memo, because the 5 of them know exactly what to do in rural America. But thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks for those questions, and especially for giving us what was the law firm? What was that?
I called it. I didn't say law firm.
Oh,
I was
okay.
specific to not say that.
Okay. Well, we do make laws.
The consulting firm of Carper, Capital, Cardin, and Kramer. I think we could do big things together.
That's great.
Yeah. So far, anyway, we've been pretty good.
I oftentimes, and I know probably all do this, I love, like, when I visit senior centers or places like that in Delaware, and I meet couples that have been married for, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, and I almost always ask them, what's the key to a long marriage? And the best answer, actually repeated by a number of people, the 2 C's, and communicate and compromise.
There you go.
And we're pretty good at that on this committee. And it gets us to a third C, which is consensus, and that's what we're trying to do.
That's how you get unanimous votes.
There you go. Thanks. All right, Senator Markley, not a C, but very much a consensus builder on his own.
No, Mr. Chairman, I feel very much excluded from that.
An honorary member.
I think we're going to have the Markey and Merkley team or something to respond. Mr. Secretary, 2 quick comments and then an advocacy. In the infrastructure bill is the Monarch and Pollinator Highway Act, an idea that came from Lamar Alexander in Tennessee to use highways to create insecticide-free pollinator plots to help maintain the strength of our pollinators. And so I just want you to be aware of that. We have seen one of our pollinators, the Western Monarch, drop to less than 1% of the population that existed 20 years ago. And obviously that's very scary indication for pollinators, but it's also touches the heart because the monarch butterfly touches the heart. And to have the next generation of children grow up and never see one is just something we can prevent by utilizing some of our byways along our highways, and would like your help on that. And it's now fully authorized. The second, I called and talked to you about vehicle charging stations and doing them in a manner that makes it as easy to fill up on electrons as it is to fill up on gasoline. Our current system is absolutely chaotic. You have no idea what system you're going to be charged for. Is it a club card? Is it by the minute? Is it by the hookup? Is it by the kilowatt hour? You have no way to compare them. You don't know if you're being price gouged, and sometimes you are after the fact. If we do these stations and they result in the expansion of the same chaotic, confusing system we have now, we will have missed a massive opportunity to do it right. And this is in your hands. Please make sure we do this right. And then let me turn to the third piece, and that is the Mega Projects Grant Program. We have in Oregon a deep water port that is unutilized in Coos Bay, and it was considered for many projects over time that have failed, including a potential LNG export facility that didn't work out for a host of reasons. But it is a perfect place for a container port. There's a whole operation underway to make this happen. You have an existing federal channel. You have quick access to the open ocean. You don't have to go 100 miles up the Columbia River as you do for the Port of Portland. It would expand the West Coast container facility effort by 10%. You have a railroad line that takes you through the coastal mountains to the Willamette Valley to a Class 1 transportation network. You have the land in place for the development of the port itself, but it's a big project. But it meets every one of the 5 stipulations for the Mega Projects Grant Program. So I'm asking for you and your team to take a very close look at this, because when I think about the vision of doing things that have regional and national significance on our transportation system, on our economy, this is it. Like this is the perfect poster child. So I would simply ask that you and your team take a very, very close look at this possibility. And I don't know if you're already familiar with it, but I'd be glad to escort you through the Coos Bay Container Port project. Years ago, the short line that existed to the Willamette Valley, the company that owned it was going to tear up the railroad tracks and sell the steel. And we got the funding in the state of Oregon to buy that line. Save that railroad line. It's being used now. It's being improved now. It will have to be improved further. We're ready to invest a lot of money to be able to double stack containers through a series of tunnels, strengthen the bridges for the weight. We have the land ready, but we're going to need significant federal support, and I hope it will be at the top of your list for the mega projects.
Well, thank you. I look forward to a chance to see the region for myself, and I'm certainly interested to discuss anything that enhances supply chain capacity in this country.
Thank you very much.
Senator Merkley, thank you for joining us. Senator Markey, I think Senator Markey has joined us. Got a couple of people in line ahead of you, but thanks for coming today. I think Senator Lummis is next, and I believe she's going to join us by WebEx. Cynthia, are you out there? Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for your time today. On February 11th, a federal court issued a preliminary injunction that prohibits 11 agencies, including the Department of Transportation, from using a metric known as the social cost of greenhouse gases. That injunction also prohibits DOT staff from participating in the interagency working group established by President Biden. His administration is using figures to help justify its sweeping environmental agenda. Has DOT fully stopped using this figure as required by the court?
So we are making sure to comply with all court decisions and relevant laws. We're still reviewing this injunction. It certainly has the potential to impact a number of rulemakings, grant programs, and other projects. And so we're trying to work through that in a way that minimizes the disruption to our ability to get rules done and to get dollars out the door, but meets our ability to, of course, respond in every legally appropriate way to the meaning of the injunction.
I'll be interested in receiving documentation demonstrating DOT's compliance with portions of the injunction. Can I rely on you to help me get that information?
We'd be happy to follow up with you on anything you need relative to our compliance.
Great, thank you so much. Now I want to switch to the issue of truck parking. Mr. Secretary, one of the issues that I focused on during my time serving on this committee has been the lack of available truck parking. It came up even as recently as last week. I was in Wyoming, got right from Cheyenne to Laramie on Interstate 80. They closed the interstate right in front of me due to weather issues. And here was a ribbon of highway with trucks lining both sides, and very difficult for anybody not driving a truck to get off. So you've got trucks idling for miles while during the hours that it took to reopen Interstate 80. States have the ability to create truck parking capacity within the current formula programs, but there's still a lack of capacity. How concerned is DOT over this issue?
Very concerned, and I appreciate you raising this. This is a very important issue, and if you talk with any truck driver, it is not only an issue of convenience, it is an issue of safety. And
Yes.
And I might add, as you pointed out, with the idling that goes on, it's even an issue of emissions. Let me mention.
Absolutely right.
So I share your enthusiasm for addressing this. I was just with a number of folks from the trucking industry the other day. Let me mention a few programs we think could be useful here. The Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, National Highway Freight Program, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, as we talked about this being a safety issue, the National Highway Performance Program, and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program. But let me also mention that I don't think it's unreasonable to look into whether the Carbon Reduction Program, and in some ways, perhaps in certain locations, a discretionary program that's for reducing truck idling at port facilities might be relevant here as well. We're hearing this everywhere we go with truck drivers, and I'd welcome an opportunity to work with you to make sure that the funding and the authorities available in the law are actually being used to alleviate that problem.
Fabulous. Thank you. I would be delighted to work with you on that. It's a big issue in my state, especially on Interstate 80, which crosses the entirety of southern Wyoming. Now, it's my understanding that the most recent Jason's Law report has been completed, but not released to the public. And can you explain what the delay is there? Jason's Law was dealt with truck parking and a couple of highway bills ago, and the report is apparently delayed.
Let me run that down and try to get more up-to-date information for you on that.
That'll be great. Hey, thank you so much, and I'll reach out to you subsequently so I can make sure that Wyoming's DOT is accessing every possible program available to alleviate our truck parking issues on Interstate 80. Really appreciate your time today, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
Senator Lummis, thanks so much for joining us. You wouldn't know this, but we're live with about the first 5 or 6 members who are asking questions, and then we went to you on WebEx, and you've heard the term "voice of God." Your voice was so loud we could probably heard you all the way in Wyoming, but
No,
a voice heard
sorry.
around the world.
Sorry about that. I don't have a Chaplain Black baritone, so that was probably a little annoying, Mr.
No, I was
Chairman.
not at
Sorry
all
about
annoyed,
that.
but he doesn't have your volume either. So, all right. It looks like Senator Padilla is next on WebEx. Senator Wicker has been here. Say again? All right, but in person, live and in person. Is that correct? Ahead of Senator Markey? All right. All right. My staff says Senator Whitehouse is next.
Senator
so-
Whitehouse.
Yeah. Sheldon, if you would
Great.
take it away, and Eddie, bear with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. I understand that there's been some suggestion that the department should not make any efforts to mitigate transportation greenhouse gas emissions or to ensure infrastructure resilience in the implementation of the infrastructure bill. And I just wanted to ask, it is true, is it not, that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law includes a climate title?
Correct.
And it is true that it also includes funding that is required to be used on emissions reductions and resilience.
Yes.
And it's also true that it requires all states to develop a strategy to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, correct?
Yes.
You had some questions about the application of the social cost of carbon decision out of the district court in Louisiana. Does that decision relieve you of any responsibilities to make decisions in a fact-based way, in a fact-based environment?
Not at all.
With respect to the Administrative Procedures Act, if facts are developed through the notice and comment procedures, you will continue to abide by the strictures of the Administrative Procedures Act and make decisions that are consistent with the facts that have been developed in the hearing process?
We would.
And in grants, is it appropriate for the department to recognize harms and benefits of applicants' projects and consider the harms or benefits of the applicants' projects in evaluating which grants should be awarded and which grants should be deferred or denied?
As provided in the authorizing statute, absolutely.
And in a fact-based environment, is it not a fact that there are substantial costs associated with carbon pollution?
Unquestionably.
In Rhode Island, the particular facts that are of most concern to us have to do with flooding. We are looking at potentially feet of sea level rise towards the end of this century. That means redrawing the map of Rhode Island. We have some of the best mapping in the country. We realized early on that FEMA maps were defective, inaccurate, and failed. So we drew our own, and that program has been very, very successful and is looked to, I think, from around the country. So I'm hoping that you'll support better mapping to make sure that the projects that you're looking at are being evaluated against best science and best predictions of what's actually going to be there as sea levels rise or as river flooding renders properties more and more vulnerable to being underwater. Is that your understanding of your responsibilities?
Certainly. I come from a river city, and I've had the experience of looking at the rising floodwaters and realizing that what was characterized as a 500-year flood is increasingly becoming almost a semi-annual event. I know that's been the experience in a lot of different places. And so sometimes we take those mapping or other criteria as given under the statute, but we always want to make sure that we are working with the most accurate and up-to-date information that we can.
The disinclination I often see in this building to take climate warnings seriously is, I think, very regrettable. And it's particularly regrettable for coastal states like mine, which are looking at very significant repercussions from our refusal to acknowledge fact-based problems that we can solidly predict are going to come at us. I think if other states were looking at having to redraw their boundaries because of a problem, they would expect some sympathy and consideration from colleagues. And I would hope that as people look at what is being predicted pretty much uniformly for coastal states, we take into consideration the reality of those concerns and the danger to our coastal environments. And it's not just me, and it's not just environmental groups, and it's not just coastal communities that are saying this. Freddie Mac, the big federal mortgage insurer, has warned that we are headed for a coastal property values crash. Now, for colleagues who don't have coastal property, they may think that's funny or not of concern to them, but the crash predicted by Freddie Mac is of such severity, like 2008 mortgage meltdown level severity, that it is predicted to cascade through the economy in the same way that that did, well beyond the affected mortgages, and create economic dislocation across the country. So please continue to pay attention to this, Mr. Secretary.
You have my commitment.
Thank you.
Senator Markey, I believe you're next. And then we'll go to Senator Ernst, I think Senator Duckworth is going to join us by WebEx, Senator Kelly Padillo. So Senator Ernst, and then back to Senator Markey. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And everything that Senator Whitehouse said goes for Massachusetts as well, by extension. We are subject to all of the same threats that Rhode Island is subject to. And again, the most important environmental case thus far in our history, Massachusetts versus the EPA, is based on the erosion of the Massachusetts coastline, and by extension, Rhode Island. And they voted 5-4 to mandate that the EPA had to make an endangerment finding. So that's already been done. So we know this is happening, and we know that we have an absolute responsibility to ensure that we put in place the protective measures. So last year, Chairman Carper and I reintroduced the Green Streets Act, which would set goals to cut emissions from the national highway system and to help states protect the systems from unavoidable climate impacts. And we've got money for that already in Build Back Better, and we still have to work hard in order to get that passed. But there are already steps you can and should take under the climate title in the bipartisan bill that Senator Whitehouse was just referring to. So could you talk about those funds and the actions which you can take in order to ensure that we are dealing with the climate-related impacts?
Gladly, Senator. This is a major priority for us. It starts with the awareness that the transportation sector is the single biggest contributor of greenhouse gases in the U.S. economy. And I view that as a challenge for us to aspire to be the biggest part of the solution. The law that you have sent to us to implement is a major part of how we can do that. I'll point quickly to just a few elements in it that will help us meet that goal. One, of course, is the electric vehicle funding. We've already put out the guidance for $5 billion in formula funding to the states for charging infrastructure along highways. That'll be followed by 2.5 in competitive funding for community charging grants, all as part of getting that network of 500,000 EV chargers up. Then, of course, there's $7.3 billion in formula funding to states and another 1.4 in competitive grants over 5 years under the PROTECT program, recognizing the climate impacts that are upon us, no matter how effective we are at mitigating them. There's the carbon reduction program, $6.4 billion to specifically reduce transportation-related emissions. I will note, and unfortunately this is something I've had to repeat a few times in different regards in this testimony, we cannot fully implement this program either while under a continuing resolution because of the prohibition on new starts. Lastly, I'll just mention the $500 million Healthy Streets program, which allows for competitive grants to deploy cool and porous pavements and to expand tree cover. These unglamorous measures, I think, can make a big difference on things like heat islands, air quality, flood risks, and other impacts from our infrastructure development.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of these companies. They have landscaping on the side of their truck as they pull up, but it's really land scraping. They just come in and just tear down the trees, tear down the green, and all of a sudden we get a beautiful new modern street in front of us. And there's just something that's been lost in our country in terms of valuing trees and all the role that can play. So I'd just like to come back to the community vehicle charging infrastructure aspect of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and what we're also going to be trying to do in the Build Back Better bill. And that is just to make sure that there's equity. So there's a lot of talk about making sure you can travel across the whole country with charging stations, but I think simultaneously it's imperative for us to focus upon communities, upon equity questions, on making sure that housing units and communities that probably aren't always thought of to be the first place where electric vehicles are going to be operating are also a part of this planning. So could you talk about that a little bit and how you're envisioning ensuring that while you can travel across the country and you can make your trip, that simultaneously people in the community that need these charges will also be given access?
Yes, thank you. The equitable access to electric vehicle charging infrastructure is a major priority, and I think it's one of the things we'll be able to support with that $2.5 billion for community charging. It's worth noting that lower income Americans would stand to benefit the most from the fuel and maintenance savings of EV ownership, provided, of course, that they could afford to purchase an EV, and there's pending legislation that might help on that front. Just a few days ago, I was in Colorado at an EV charging station at a public housing facility where there's an electric car share program. So I think it's a great example of how we can move out of the old view where EVs were regarded as a luxury item and recognize them as something that, with support from our policies, should be accessible to everybody.
No, thank you. My father was a truck driver, and you kind of get a job where your father worked. So I got a job driving a truck for 4 years. That's how I worked my way through college. But it was an ice cream truck. So I had to pull it into the driveway every night, jump out, and plug it into the side of the house. It took under 15 seconds every night. Now, my father hadn't thought it through because now his car can't be in the driveway. My ice cream truck is there. But nonetheless, if we think it through, and Malden is still a community in the bottom quartile of income in Massachusetts, with a plan for those kind of communities as well, I think people can adapt very easily. So I thank you for your leadership, Mr. Secretary. And by the way, I once again give you the invitation. I come up and see the Bourne and the Sagamore Bridge in Massachusetts.
I have not forgotten, and I would have been shocked if it didn't come up, Senator. Thank you.
And you will come?
You can count on it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're pretty persistent, I would say that. You get an A for persistent. That's good. I think Senator Ernst is next. I think you're line joining in. Good to see you today, and you're recognized. Please proceed.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us today as well. And Senator Markey's line of questioning actually will lead into my line of questioning as well. And I know that the American people really have the Russian invasion of Ukraine first and foremost on their minds, as well as higher energy costs. So I am of the thought that energy security is national security. And while it is absolutely clear that you support America's clean energy economy, my concern is that electric vehicles are being prioritized over our biofuels. And this will only make us more dependent on those foreign adversaries who control the majority of worldwide production for a number of the key components that do go into electric vehicles, the cobalt, the lithium, the graphite. So we do need to be aware of that. And here is an interesting statistic that goes along with this. The Energy Information Administration has projected that 79% of car sales in 2050, so about another 30 years away, will use liquid fuels. And the USDA states that ethanol has a 46% lower greenhouse gas profile than gasoline. And I know you're from the Midwest, and I know there's a lot of biofuels as well in Indiana. Would you agree that the renewable fuel standard and biofuels are an equally, if not more effective solution to the American energy independence that we need, while also securing a cleaner energy future?
Well, thanks for the question. And as you note, I come from a part of the country where this is very important as well. As a matter of fact, when I was mayor and ran the water utility for our city, my biggest customer was the ethanol plant in our community. When you look at our EV policy, of course, the focus is on zero emissions vehicles. But I also have a great deal of regard for the role of biofuels and homegrown fuels in America's energy mix. And while our work on the zero emission vehicles doesn't really allow us to pick winners and losers outside the boundaries of the categories put forward in the law. Certainly am interested in opportunities that exist, and notably one area where I think there's increasing interest, while there, of course, is a continued very important role in fueling the cars on the road today, is around sustainable aviation fuels, and would love to have a dialogue with you on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do appreciate that. And if there are additional ways that we can use our biofuels, we certainly want to find those avenues. You did just mention zero emissions for those electric vehicles, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Within that, electric vehicles are considered zero emissions, and biofuels are considered low emissions. But when we have looked into this, electric vehicles actually do have a significant greenhouse gas footprint from the beginning of their manufacture, whether that's battery creation, actually building the vehicle, and not to mention that probably a lot of the electricity that's being used to power those vehicles is coming from non-renewable sources. So could you agree that perhaps those electric vehicles are not truly zero emissions?
Well, any economic activity, manufacturing could have a carbon profile. But we also have done the analysis to demonstrate that even if the electricity is generated from fossil fuels, the carbon emissions associated with driving a vehicle will typically be lower if it is an electric vehicle compared to if those fuels are being combusted in the vehicle itself. But certainly would agree that this is not a black or white issue, that there are many different energy profiles of many different ways of getting around. Again, I think back to my experience as mayor and our enthusiasm for using CNG in the vehicles that we had at the time, even taking waste gas from our wastewater facility and putting it into our trash trucks.
Yeah, I think that we should be exploring all different opportunities that are out there, but do want to make sure that at least our American public understands that with the creation of these vehicles and their battery components, many of those components coming from overseas and adversarial countries, just understanding the impacts that we have in creating those vehicles as well. But thank you. I appreciate your time so much, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Senator.
Senator, thanks so much for those questions and for joining us today. But the point that you make is a good one. One of the points you make is a good one. I understand, I've added my stats just to double check, but I think our friends at General Motors have indicated they're going to not be selling vehicles that are powered by fossil fuels some point in time. And I think the number 2035 sticks in my mind. The folks at Chrysler, what used to be Chrysler, have similar kind of expectations. Those are being pushed by market forces more than anything else. But as a guy who spent a lot of years in airplanes, Navy airplanes, the importance of biofuels with respect to air travel, and that's a key. That's a big important one. I'm glad to see the secretary's on top of that. All right, thank you, Joni. All right, and I believe the next person on our list is Senator Duckworth. I believe she's joining us by WebEx. Senator Duckworth, are you there?
I sure am, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with you on the importance of biofuels for aviation. United Airlines is really making some of those investments, my hometown airline out of Chicago. I also want to associate myself with the comments of my friend, Senator Ernst from Iowa, that the RFS is critically important for that clean energy future, and that biofuels are a critical part of that. And I just want to stress that the cost of gasoline at the pump is not dictated by the price of RINs, and that there are other factors that drive up the price of gasoline at the pump. But Mr. Secretary, I thank you for being here today, and I want to commend you for taking the initiative last year to restore the local labor hiring pilot program. We share a real commitment to empowering communities to design infrastructure contracts that prioritize creating new jobs through local and economic hiring programs. As a former mayor, can you explain the job creation benefits of providing local leaders with the freedom and flexibility to decide for themselves whether they wish to prioritize local job creation when awarding construction contracts?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question, Senator. You know, too often we hear stories from people who live in a community, they see an infrastructure project happening around them, they see the folks in the hard hats with good paying jobs working literally in their neighborhood, and think to themselves, it doesn't appear that anybody here working on this project looks like they came from anywhere near here. And it's partly in response to that. And on the positive side, in response to the enormous opportunity to build generational wealth, to support pathways into the middle class, that we want to support local communities that are choosing to move in this direction. And so we've reactivated the pilot program as available to Federal Highway under the law, and look forward to working with all of the authorities and flexibilities that exist within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to continue to open that door for local and economic hiring, because we know how much it means to communities, to neighborhoods, and to families.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. That's why one of my top priorities during the development of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was making sure we eliminated the outdated one-size-fits-all ban on including local hiring incentives in construction project contracts. Mr. Secretary, as we work to create new good-paying jobs that put residents back to work rebuilding their local communities, how will new and existing US DOT grant programs evaluate applications that include local and economic hiring preferences?
Well, thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it's very specific that a recipient may use a local or other geographic or economic hiring preference for labor on construction projects that are funded. As a result, we are going to be moving forward in a way that is consistent with that legal framework. And it does update things for some of our state and local partners. So the ability to transition from that pilot program that we were proud to launch in May of 2021 to allowing those preferences now authorized under the law, I think is a big step and a very positive one that's going to position us to really unlock so much of the economic potential of this bill.
Thank you. One of the other things that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law does is that it recognizes a basic principle. As we work to repair and enhance our infrastructure, we must also make sure that these upgrades benefit all Americans. That's why I fought so hard to include the All Station Accessibility Program, or ASAP Act, in the law. I was pleased that the Biden administration recognized the importance of ASAP by including it in its top 10 programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that you may not have heard about fact sheet. Secretary Buttigieg, can you explain how our new $1.75 billion ASAP grant programs improves mobility for commuters with disabilities? by prioritizing accessibility efforts such as the Chicago Transit Authority's ASAP plan? And how does it accelerate project deployment, which otherwise would take decades for transit and commuter rail systems to complete?
Well, thank you. As you know, and as you showed to me when I was able to visit CTA with you last year, though 75% of America's rail transit stations are ADA accessible, the remaining 25% will remain inaccessible, even as we look back to the time that has passed since the 1990 ADA, because they have that legacy date associated with them prior to the act. So thanks to the ASAP program, thanks to that $1.75 billion, there's an opportunity to update those legacy rail transit stations that were set up pre-ADA and make them accessible with projects to repair or modify or retrofit them so that they have that accessibility. We are working hard on making that program available. We anticipate it being available later this year. As you know, it's $350 million each year across 5 years. And we think it's so important for not just, of course, the basic equity and fairness at stake, but unlocking the economic potential of communities with so many workers with disabilities who could be better able to contribute to the economy and life of their communities, provided they could get to where they need to be.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot for joining us, Secretary Duckworth. We've been joined by, this is one, Senator, many of you know that Senator Duckworth served our country with great valor, courage, and we're proud of her service. Senator Sullivan is a Marine Colonel, and not everybody knows that, but thank you for that service, and it's wonderful, wonderful to serve with you. We got the Navy, we got the Marines here, we got the Navy here. It's pretty good lineup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as a Navy captain, I think we had a couple Navy captains on this committee, yourself included, and Senator Kelly, so.
There you go.
And we even have a Navy vet testifying too, so I won't be too hard on him as a Marine. I'll just give him a little bit of a break. But thank you. Mr. Secretary, good to see you. I wanted to follow on our conversation. Last July, we talked about the needs at the Port of Alaska, and that's in Anchorage, and how important that is strategically, not just for Alaska, but for the country. And I'm going to remind you about some of that discussion. But first, I want to re-get your commitment to come on up to Alaska and actually see and walk the ground with me this port and other aspects of our infrastructure sometime soon.
Yes, I'm continuing to look forward to it. That much more so now that we've been able to fund some very worthy projects with the last couple of rounds.
Very worthy, and I appreciate the RAISE grants that you got out quickly. That was really important for my state. And so back to the Port of Alaska, it moves 90% of all goods that come into Alaska, 90%, so very important that way. And that includes 90% of the liquid fuel, including most of the jet fuel used at J-Bear. So by the end of this year, Alaska is going to have over 100 fifth-generation fighters based in our state. Those are F-35s, F-22s. No place on the planet Earth has that kind of fifth-gen fighter firepower. And it's also most of the fuel used at Ted Stevens International Airport, which during the pandemic surged to the 4th busiest air cargo terminal in the world. So again, very strategic for the country. As you know, the Department of Defense designated 17 commercial strategic seaports that support the DoD mission. The Port of Alaska is one of just 17. I just actually met with the Transcom commander yesterday. We had a long discussion about this. In the FY 2020 NDAA, I included a requirement for an assessment by DoD and Transcom on our 17 strategic ports. The 2 DoD strategic ports that came in last in terms of their readiness, infrastructure capability was the Port of Tacoma and the Port of Alaska. And so Senator Cantwell and I have been working on getting a focus both on these two ports, which are actually interconnected in terms of commerce between our two states. So we're working on a meeting, actually with you and the MIRAD commander. Can I get your commitment to work with me in Senator Cantwell's office to get that done soon?
I would look forward to it. You have my commitment.
So here's the big issue for me, and I really need your commitment on this, and you might be aware of it, you might not, but just 2 months ago, you know, there's been a lot of litigation dating back almost 20 years between MARAD and the city of Anchorage, breach of contracts and everything that have started back in the early 2000s. And the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, just in December, decided in favor of the municipality of Anchorage in this way too long litigation, in my view. And they announced ruling on the damages just last week. So here's the commitment I need from you, Mr. Secretary. Notwithstanding this court decision, I'd like your assurance that this award is not treated by the DOT as an award in lieu of any of the future grants for which the municipality is interested in applying that relate to this port. We think that would be unfair. This legal award, and who knows, they're probably going to appeal it, and it's going to take 10 more years. But it fills a hole that was created with these breach of contracts, bad construction work, part of the problem there that had been done. And what we don't want to have happen is all of a sudden DOT say, well, the Port of Anchorage or Port of Alaska doesn't need any assistance because it just got this award. I think that would be unfair. And I just want to make sure I get your rock solid commitment that you will not do that as you're looking at grants, which we, Port of Tacoma, others, particularly as part of the strategic DoD port network, really need and we think we're worthy of.
Yes, I don't know of anything in that lawsuit or related to it that would have any effect on current eligibility for a grant there.
Good, so nobody's gonna go and go, well, you know, the Port of Alaska just got this big award, so we're not gonna give them a grant because they just got something. That, you're not gonna do that.
That's not how we'll evaluate grants.
Okay, good, that's very important to me. I appreciate your straight up answer, and I just hope your staff's watching and all the people who do the evaluations, because their boss just said they're not going to do that. And my constituents, as you can imagine, were happy about the award. I'm sorry, happy about the litigation finally looking like we've prevailed, but now they're worried that someone's going to take it out and use it against us, and I appreciate you definitively saying that's not going to happen.
Thank you. Yeah, my understanding is all of the relevant issues are, as you pointed out, from many years ago.
Yeah, almost 20 years ago.
So we don't view that as relevant to current eligibilities for current grant programs.
Great. I have some more questions for the record, Mr. Chairman, but thank you.
I'm sure you do, but I think you got your money's worth here on the first round. So you're welcome to stick around for another round if you'd like. Thank you. I think on the commitments per minute, that's probably got the most commitments of anybody that's questioned him today. That's not bad. All right. Thanks for joining us today, Colonel. All right. I think Senator Stabenow has joined us. Senator Stabenow, who also chairs the Ag Committee from Great Lakes, state of Michigan, home of the Detroit Tigers.
That's right. Well, good morning.
And hopefully, let me just say,
Ranking member.
hopefully we'll have an announcement before too long that the baseball strike is over and we can say, play ball. I can't wait.
Mr. Chairman is the second greatest champion of the Detroit Tigers. I'm first, he's second. So we look forward to hosting you. And I have to say, actually, welcome to a fellow Michigander. I'm so pleased that you and Chasten and your two beautiful children have set up shop in Michigan permanently. Of course, Chasten was always there with his family, but we're glad you're Michiganders, Mr. Secretary.
Well, I'm happy to have married into Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also so pleased you're in the position that you are in. And we've talked a lot about infrastructure for a long time, and we've actually been able to deliver it working together. So this is an important moment. You won't be surprised to learn I'd like to talk about electric vehicles. And I am going to brag for a moment because I think it's important when we look at the incredible investments, the way our American companies are leaning in now and counting on us to be their partner if they're going to be successful. But GM, Ford, Stellantis have laid out aggressive plans to electrify their vehicle fleets. In fact, Stellantis just yesterday announced an electric Jeep they're doing for 2023. I've driven that, it's really something. And electric Ram pickup in 2024, and plans to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. GM, of course, is doing 30 new battery electric vehicles worldwide by 2025, plans to only do electric vehicles by 2035. And Ford, of course, the great F-150 truck I've also had the opportunity to drive, and the Mach-E Mustang, and their plans to increase EV production next year to 600,000 units globally. If they're going to succeed with this kind of aggressive electrification plans, the charging stations in the legislation we passed is absolutely critical. So what type of technical expertise is the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy providing to states? Because we do know that states are at various levels of planning at this point.
Well, thank you, and that's right. The technical support is going to be very important because this is not the same thing as gas stations. In some ways, electric vehicle charging is easier than filling up with gas because you can do it at home. In other ways, it's more difficult because of the time involved depending on which type of charger you have. And so we need a paradigm that really works for an EV network for the future. This is exactly the kind of work that the new Joint Office of Energy and Transportation that we've set up with Secretary Granholm is taking on. And now that we've put out the call for states to submit their plans, we're looking forward to seeing what they come back with by the August deadline and working very closely with them on how to make sure that no state, no community is left behind with the opportunity.
Absolutely, and I do have to say, when I'm asked about high gas prices, which right now are extremely high, that I'm looking forward to a very short time in the future when you can drive right by the gas station with your electric vehicle and not worry about what it says at the pump. So I think that's an important part of our future. Let me ask another question about another really important piece of the bill that I've spent a lot of time on over a number of years, and that's Buy American, and being able to really provide more integrity and transparency. Waivers in the past have been used over and over again to waive the requirements rather than really looking for the businesses that can actually provide the American-made goods and services. So there are several provisions of my Make It in America bill in this law, but I want to ask you specifically about two provisions that we've asked Department of Transportation to focus on. And one is to ensure that domestic industries are ready to provide products for all modes of transportation. And then secondly, and I think this is very important, before the department issues a waiver to use federal funds to purchase iron or steel or manufactured products to meet Buy America standards, that you're required to reach out to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and provide small and medium-sized manufacturers with the first opportunity to produce these hard-to-find items for our nation's infrastructure projects. In other words, I know in Michigan, and we saw this during the pandemic, when the call went out with what we needed, our companies were able to quickly retool to provide that. And if they know that there is a marketplace, I really believe that small and medium-sized manufacturers are going to be able to step up, which is more jobs, obviously, more investment in America.
Thank you. Yes, we're committed to these provisions of the law, not only because it is called for in the law, but also, as you know, this administration and this president are enthusiastic about Buy America and having more manufacturing here in America. Among other things, part of the solution, the long-term solution to our supply chain issues is to be less reliant on things coming in from overseas. And so we will work to make sure that those US-based companies have a heads up as part of that waiver process so that they might be able to respond. And we'll work to meet all of the parameters that are laid out and hopefully exceed them.
Terrific. I'm really looking forward to working with you on this. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Stabenow. Thanks for your great leadership on the Ag Committee. There's a lot of interface, as you know, with the work that we do in this committee. Senator Sabinov's been kind to welcome me to the Detroit Auto Show for more years than I can remember. And that was about 10 years ago. I remember looking at one of they call them the, I forget which auto company, but they were like, they had on display a vehicle that was in a garage. This is like a mock-up using 2x4s. The vehicle was in a garage, and the garage was alongside of a house, all of a mock-up, and in front of us. And I asked the people who from that company, I said, what does this represent? And they said, this is hydrogen. This is hydrogen. And they said that the vehicle here is going to be powered someday by hydrogen, hopefully what we call clean hydrogen. And they have no emissions, and they use fuel cells. And the same technology will heat this garage, this house, using your imagination, in the winter and cool it in the summer. And you know what? That day has come. And when we look at reducing emissions from large trucks, vans, and so forth, the key, some of them use electric, will use electric, are using electric, but a bunch of them are going to use hydrogen, as you know, and that's a good thing. Very
Mr.
good.
Chairman, if I might just add, I'm a strong supporter of hydrogen fuel cells as well, and part of what we're doing in Michigan is working with the Army, who's right on the front lines right now driving these vehicles, and you're absolutely right. Particularly in Department of Defense, there's tremendous enthusiasm, as well as larger fleets. So this is a really important part of the equation.
Thanks so much. Speaking of the Department of Defense, Captain Mark Kelly, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a fan of fuel cells as well, having used them on other vehicles in other places. And I do look forward to my invitation to the Detroit Auto Show at some point. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again, twice in 2 days.
That's right.
And thank you for being here today. I was really proud to have had the opportunity to work to craft the bipartisan infrastructure law, both as a member of this committee, but also in the group of members that negotiated the final deal. And one of the aspects that I'm most proud of is how this law was crafted to meet the needs of different states having different needs. And in Arizona, one top priority is funding to strengthen our state's interstate highways. Arizona's different from many other states. When the interstate highway system was designed in the 1950s and 60s, Arizona was a small population state, and their infrastructure needs looked a lot different. Compared to other regions, our interstate highways are not designed to meet the needs of our growing state and the growing Southwest. Right now, Interstate 10, which connects Phoenix and Tucson, the two largest metropolitan areas in the state, still, to this day, just has 2 lanes and sections, long sections, and a single accident can cause traffic jams for hours. I've spent 6.5 hours on that highway, stuck in a traffic jam, when the normal drive is about 90 minutes. And these traffic jams happen every single day on average. And despite being 2 of the fastest growing cities in the country, another issue we have is Phoenix and Las Vegas. Phoenix and Las Vegas still are not connected via an interstate highway. And that's why I worked in this committee and on the floor to support the creation of the new National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program, which we're calling the Mega Projects Program, to fund major transportation projects with national or regional economic mobility and safety benefits. Or, in other words, projects like the I-10 expansion between Phoenix and Tucson, or the construction of I-11 between Phoenix and Las Vegas would be these mega projects. So, Mr. Secretary, would you agree that Arizona and other fast-growing states have different roadway infrastructure needs than other states? And how do you believe the infrastructure law can help states like Arizona fund long overdue interstate expansion projects?
Thank you for the question, and the example you raise is a great one of how the infrastructure needs of our states differ. I come from a community that lost about 30% of its population in the 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the time that I was mayor. And so we had built for more roads than we had taxpayers or drivers to support them, and found that in some contexts, some of our roads needed to go on a diet. Although I'm pleased to say my hometown's growing again. But some of the fastest growing communities are in places like Arizona. And the needs are an example of why, for example, in Federal Highways internal guidance, there was an effort to point out that none of that would stand in the way of a capacity expansion where it's appropriate. And you've raised both the need for, or the vision for an entirely new stretch of highway with I-11 or a capacity expansion on I-10. There are many sources of funding in the formula funds, potentially mega projects and others that could go toward this use in the infrastructure law. I would also add one thing I've admired in Arizona is the funding and support that's gone into transit, including across community lines, party lines, county lines. And that can serve to take pressure off of congestion, even while capacity expansion is being considered at the same time.
And is there anything you could share about the timing for the mega projects program?
I can tell you that we're working right now on getting the guidance ready, and that part of what we're working on there is to make sure that it's a flagship example of a notice of funding opportunity that's user-friendly for applicants. So we want to get it right, but we also want to get it out the door quickly.
And what do you think applicants might need to do to be successful in applying for these funds?
Well, of course, first the guidance will lay out the kind of basic expectations for the use of federal taxpayer dollars. Next will be the aspirations of these funds that are going to projects, as you know, having helped to craft them, that can't necessarily be met by any other source. Too big, too complex, too multi-jurisdictional, or for some other reason, might not happen but for a grant out of the mega program. So the ability to demonstrate that and to speak to the other policy priorities that are encoded in the law, I think will make for the strongest applications.
Well, thank you, and we look forward in Arizona to see the rolling out of this mega projects program and the details for how to apply and be successful. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Kelly, thank you so much. Thanks for your deep involvement in these issues on behalf of Arizona and our country. Thank you. I believe Senator Padilla, who's been waiting patiently on WebEx, is ready to participate. And after that, if we have no one else who joins us that hasn't already spoken, I'm going to yield back to our ranking member, and then I'll close it out. Senator Padilla, are you with us on WebEx?
I am here, Mr. Chairman. Thank
Great,
you
great, great.
very much. Last but certainly not least. I think we all recognize that after decades of neglect and underinvestment, the bipartisan infrastructure law is delivering billions in much needed new funding to strengthen our nation's transportation supply chain while improving our nation's competitiveness, lowering costs for American families, reducing emissions, and all the multiple policy objectives we had when we voted for the historic piece of legislation. This includes accelerating investment in our ports, waterways, and freight networks. So, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for your work to increase federal flexibilities for port grants. And we've talked about it over the phone, given some of the choke points that we've experienced in California. You've worked with us to fast track some port infrastructure grant awards and announce new construction projects for coastal navigation, inland waterways, and land ports of entry. So I wanted to start off by giving credit where credit is due and lead with a thank you. As you know, working with the governor and part of his team, California plays a central role in the movement of goods, not just locally or regionally, but throughout the United States. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach alone account for approximately 40% of the container traffic that enters the country. That's huge. And last October, the state of California, working with your office, the U.S. Department of Transportation, entered into an emerging projects agreement to help ease access to federal financing programs for nationally significant port and supply chain resilience infrastructure projects. This January, just a month and a half ago, Governor Newsom's state budget proposal for the next fiscal year includes $1.2 billion for port and freight infrastructure projects, including, and this is intentional, to leverage federal grants provided by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as federal credit programs through the Emerging Projects Agreement. So I know it's a long setup here, but the question is, given the state of California's proposed significant state funding contribution for the specific purpose of attracting federal investment through grants and financing, what can the Department of Transportation do to reward states, make that an incentive for states that are taking proactive steps and putting their own skin in the game?
Well, thank you for the question and for the conversations that we've had about just how important it is to do everything that we can to support goods movement and supply chains in this country. As you know, ports like those in California have such economic significance in terms of the volume that comes through them that you feel the impact of their success or their problems as far away as my Indiana hometown. And I think for that reason, it's been especially rewarding to see creative approaches taken like that Emerging Projects Agreement. And we hope that there will be more where that came from as other states look at that example, effectively helping to fast track many of these credit programs that we think could make a difference when it comes to alleviating those supply chain issues. You also mentioned that California is a state that has acted already to put up a great deal of funding through an ambitious budget supporting transportation. I've seen similar things in Colorado, Illinois, and others. And I want to emphasize that, especially if anybody gets the wrong idea and thinks, why would we put up this state money when there's federal money coming? That states that choose to step up are putting themselves in an excellent position to take advantage of the federal funding that has been made possible by Congress and the administration. And I don't mean that in the sense of putting a thumb on the scale, but rather just as a clear fact that when you already have more investment ready to go into a local match or to make sure that a project can be done with whatever slice of it is being proposed for support from a discretionary program, that much more is going to be achieved in the state. And so I do think states that have taken those steps, that have taken the initiative to put up funding for infrastructure, will be especially well positioned to take advantage of this national vision for infrastructure development that the president is leading.
Great. I'll look forward to following up with you on not just the funding opportunities, but also the financing programs, including RIF, TIFIA, and others to reflect the same, incentivizing, rewarding states that are stepping up and willing to put skin in the game. I'll be brief with my next and final question, and that's just acknowledging the size of the agricultural industry in California, including a lot of perishable crops and the supply chain issues that we've experienced for many, many months. I know you and Secretary Vilsack have teamed up to be responsive to those concerns, reaching out to carriers, doing everything possible to keep goods moving, not just on the import side, but especially the export side, which is critical to growers in California. Can you just make any brief comments on how it's going, any new ideas, how we can continue to work together with stakeholders?
Yes, thank you for the question, because while most of the coverage on supply chains has looked at things like electronics or clothing coming in from Asia, the export side is extremely important when it comes to our agricultural goods being able to get out. This is another area where collaborations have played an important role. I would note a partnership with the Port of Oakland, for example, to establish what we're calling a pop-up site or container yard, effectively a temporary site that helps ease congestion and keep those goods flowing, especially since, as you mentioned, they're often perishable or part of a cold chain. And so it's especially important that they flow promptly. We'd welcome more opportunities to think about how to add ways to make better use of the capacity we've had. I'll also say that suitability for agricultural exports is one way to be competitive with grants that are looking for economic impact on the discretionary side. And the guidance will make more clear how to appropriately speak to that. But I think it's certainly something worth considering for anyone proposing a supply chain related project.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. A lot to follow up on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Patti, we're glad that you could join us remotely and look forward to seeing you later today on the floor. Senator Capito is now going to ask maybe a couple of closing questions and offer whatever closing statements and thoughts you'd like to present. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I also want to thank you personally for the personal outreach that you have extended to me and to my staff numerous times and shared your cell phone and all of that. Your accessibility is really remarkable, and I really appreciate that as we move through the implementation. That will be very important. I do want to add to the record, unanimous consent, these are documents that show the questions, letters from different states and other stakeholders and from lawmakers questioning the guidance document.
Without objection.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to that one more time, and I want to ask you a question. Have you had any conversations with Mr. Landrieu, who is charged by the president to implement the bipartisan infrastructure bill on this topic that we've talked about, the guidance issue?
I remember him mentioning that he got some calls about it around the time that it came up, but we haven't talked through the substance of the memo in detail.
Well, I would suggest that you that you have another conversation. I was in a meeting last week with him with numerous lawmakers to where this issue was discussed briskly, I will say, and so I would suggest that is he's hearing from a lot of different people that I'm sure you're hearing from, but he might be hearing it from a little bit different angle, and so on that last topic, I would say in response to the question that Senator Kelly asked, and this was around the mega projects, but I would imagine that this is all guidance. Your quote was, and I just wrote it down, guidance lays out basic expectations. And I think that's where the issue is with this December 16th guidance letter. The other thing I'd like to say is in terms of what Senator Whitehouse said and some of the comments that you have said, this is a bipartisan bill that we passed. There is a climate title in there. There is an emphasis on finding resiliency, greenhouse gas mitigation, carbon emissions, healthy streets. This is an area that we are deeply committed to. These are grant programs. These are not the formula dollars that go out. So I want to make the distinction, and would you agree, these are two separate programs or pots of money, so to speak. So the discussion that I'm having with you on this guidance doesn't really apply to the climate title parts of the bill. Would you say that's correct?
I think most of what we've been discussing in that context was outside federal aid highway programs. Yeah.
Right, yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, a question on you put out a combined notice of funding for 3 different programs, the MEGA, the EMFRA, and the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program, which obviously is one that I'm most interested in, or not most interested in, but very interested in. And my understanding is that this is sort of an unusual approach. I'm not sure how to really calculate. I guess I'd like to know why you're doing this, and then the education and outreach that you've done to the states, because this is a different way of looking at this.
Yes, thanks for asking that. What we're trying to do is make our grant process more simplified and user-friendly, less duplicative. Especially knowing that the easier we can make our processes to navigate, the more we're going to see rural communities with fewer resources, able to take advantage of it. Our staff likens it to a common application for college, so you don't have to put in your zip code 9 different times. Of course, there's information that sometimes is very customized to these specialized programs, but if we can gather it up all at once and only ask you to fill 1 form instead of 3, we think it's one example of reducing the administrative burden associated with what can already be a daunting set of requirements to try to apply for these programs.
Well, good, because I mean, that's sort of the way I saw it. I thought, well, it's trying to be a simplification. I guess the devil's in the details to see how that actually rolls out. And I don't think bureaucracy in any place is known for simplification or anything. So I hope that is the end result, because if you're looking at opening up these applications to different, not just state DOTs, but municipalities, and where they don't have our state DOT basically helps all our municipalities write all of their grant applications that they can have right now anyway in this area. So thank you for that. On the EV, just a quick question. I might be off base here, not understanding it. So the money goes, you've already put the guidance out, and I think you said $6 billion, and the state's $5 billion, and the state's going to build and maybe get contractors to build the EV stations in public areas, I guess. The question that came to me was, once that's completed, the ownership and maintenance and liabilities of those facilities then goes to?
So we don't generally view these as government-owned and operated, and certainly not federal government-owned and operated charging stations. But part of what I hope will come of the flexibility for the states to come in with their plans is different approaches. Notably, the law provides for maintenance to be one eligible use of the funding, and capital to be another. And we certainly won't have all of the answers here in Washington on which is the more efficient way to set up a public-private partnership. In other words, which piece of it being subsidized will prove to be the most efficient. So I think it's a great example of a laboratory of ideas where different states working with different private partners will come up with different models to effectively buy down the difference of the cost in getting those EV chargers up and running so that they can make for that national network.
So then you would anticipate that issue of maintenance and liability and other issue would be worked out on the front end rather than, oh, now we have this, who's going to take care of it?
Yes, I think that's right. Those are the kinds of things we're working through with the Joint
Okay.
Office right now, and we'd be happy to keep you apprised.
Yeah, that's a question that came to me. And then this is kind of a question out of left field, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You know, the president gave his State of the Union address last night. He started with Ukraine. Obviously, thank you for your service. You know what's in the hearts and minds of our military as they're sort of on tenuous ground right now in terms of families being deployed to the NATO nations. Have you had any conversations, or have any conversations occurred with you and your department as to what role you might play in terms of ratcheting down any involvement we have with Russian-made goods, Russian commerce, Russian contractors? I mean, is this something that's into your realm or not?
To some extent, yes, and this was a theme of a conversation I had late yesterday afternoon with my counterpart, the Ukrainian Minister of Infrastructure, as well as their ambassador in Washington. And one of the things we discussed was something that they requested that the president then announced last night, which was the closure of the U.S. airspace to Russian aircraft. There may be other steps that would be appropriate that are within our authorities. Obviously, this situation is fast unfolding, and so we're moving quickly to assess them. But I do think there are a number of things with regard to infrastructure and certainly with regard to travel that we need to look at as a way to make good on our commitment to support the Ukrainian people. And I'm also in frequent contact with many of my counterparts among our allies and partners to look at what they're doing, what we might be doing, and how best to coordinate.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that as time goes on, because I think we certainly don't want to get into a situation where we find out, as I think we've been enlightened to, that we've been importing 600,000 barrels of oil from Russia, that our transportation system is wholly reliable, obviously not wholly reliable, partly reliable, or certain parts or certain minerals or whatever is relying on the Russian economy, because what we see going on, and I think we all agree here, is egregious in terms of Russia's aggression. And we want to shut that down as quickly as we can. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Senator Capito, thanks for those closing thoughts and for helping to help us put together. I think it's been a terrific hearing. It's very informative. Thank you. Your staff, our staff's on the majority side as well. Mr. Secretary, one of the things I like to do when we have an important issue like today, if we have a panel where you have different points of view, as Senator Capito said, sometimes I'll just kick it back to the panel and just ask them to, 3 or 4 or 5 people are on a panel, I'll ask them to see, tell us, where's the consensus, where's the agreement? I could kick this back to you. This is pretty easy because you're the panel. And you tried in the conversation for the last couple of hours to help us a bit with consensus and communications and all. Would you have, like to take just a couple of minutes, just to kind of sum up and come back, maybe reiterate something?
Sure,
Or maybe touch on something that you haven't touched, maybe answer a question that hasn't been asked. So,
Well, I will say, I think I missed an opportunity with regard to Senator Capito's question about one federal decision to note that there's already been one time hack in the law, which was the 60-day requirement to share information on the categorical exclusions, and we've met that. So I did not mean to be abstract in talking about our desire to meet some of those other goals, but we've met our requirements so far and are committed to continue to do that. So I appreciate the chance to revise and extend there. I'll be very concise, noting I'm a panel of one, and just express again, kind of as I began, my appreciation and gratitude for the work of this committee. I really believe that the improvements we're going to make, the things we're going to fix, and the things we're going to build across the different areas of transportation infrastructure, they're going to help goods get to where they need to go affordably and swiftly. They're going to help people get to where they need to be. They're going to create so many jobs in this country. And I think we're all going to be proud of them. And at a time when all of us worked through this last year where there were many commentators scoffing at the idea you could have a bipartisan anything law, the fact that legislation of this scope and scale and ambition was passed by this Congress, largely built in this committee and signed by this president, is an extraordinary thing, and our department takes very seriously our responsibility and our opportunity to make the most of this and to get it right, because I doubt we'll get an opportunity this compelling again. So thank you.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think I speak not just for Senator Capito, but for all of our colleagues on this committee. It's really been a privilege for us at this point in time in our nation's history to have a chance, coming out of the worst pandemic in 100 years, so one of the worst recessions since the Great Depression, to have the opportunity to work on a set of issues that really will help get this economy moving, make us more productive, and enable us to help a whole lot of families who need some hope and need some help. When I love to go to schools, I know you've been to a ton of schools, we all have, and have assemblies with kids and so forth. They ask us what we do, and not uncommon well, especially when I'm in elementary schools with an assembly of kids, and they'll say, what do you do? And I'll say, I'm a United States Senator. They say, well, what do you do? And I said, we help make the rules for the country. And what do you do? What else do you do? And one of the things we really try to help people. And as a native of West Virginia and someone who's lived most of his life in Delaware, one of the best ways that you can help somebody is make sure they have a job. And the 8 years I was privileged to be the governor of Delaware. We used to have presidents of Delaware, but I was privileged to be the governor of Delaware. The more jobs were created in those 8 years than any 8-year period in the history of the state of Delaware. I didn't create one of them. I helped create a nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation. There's a lot of ways to do that. We've talked about some of them, but a really important one here today is transportation, the ability for people to get where they need to go, goods to get where they need to go in a timely way, and to enable us to foster even more job creation. I think, let me just take a look at my notes here. There's, oh yeah, I have some just a couple of questions and a couple of points I need to make sure this is on the record. But aside, let me just say we have a lot of witnesses who come before us, including a lot of folks from this administration, earlier administration. I've always described you. People say, "What's he like?" I say, "He's smart. He's smart." And I'll say the other thing, he's practical. And plain spoken, but actually has a great grasp on issues and is able to really walk and chew gum at the same time and do it better than most anybody I've had before our committee from any administration. So we thank you for all that. I just want to say thank you for your willingness to be responsive and to really say to your team, members of your team, your expectations, and you set a good example with that regard. We need a couple of nominations, as you know, from the administration. One of them is the head of Highway Administration. It's hugely important, as you know. There's a couple of others as well, and we need that. We need on our, pardon, go ahead. Air. Yeah, the Office of Air. That's
Yes.
Yeah. We need to pass not a continuing resolution, we need to pass an omnibus and fund this government to the end of this fiscal year, to the end of September. Senator Capito is a senior member of the Appropriations Committee. She's working hard on that, along with her other colleagues. It would be a shame if we spent all these years year after year having an infrastructure week. Well, and then another infrastructure week the next year, and another infrastructure. Well, as I said earlier, this is infrastructure decade, and we want to make sure that we get a lot of stuff done. And part of that is on us, part of that is on you, and communicating, collaborating will, I think, set a good example for this country and fulfill the needs that we've been expressed as to us, and the hopes that have been expressed. That's that last thing, a little bit of housekeeping, if I could, before we adjourn. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, Wednesday, March 16th. We'll compile those questions. We'll send them to you, Mr. Secretary, and your team. We ask you to reply to them by Wednesday, April the 6th. And a lot of us spent a couple of hours together last night as president of our country. Did what presidents have done for many years, and is deliver the State of the Union message. He spent the first almost hour talking about what's going on in the country of Ukraine, and laid out what we're trying to do, in the coalition that he's helped to assemble. We have a couple of Ukrainian churches in my state, and I had the opportunity to worship there on Sunday at both of them in a show of solidarity. I think I speak for every member of this panel, everybody in the Senate. We could not allow to stand what Putin is doing in Russia. And I don't say this lightly, but if he's allowed to get away with this with respect to Ukraine, I spent some time flying missions in and out of the South China Sea, including Taiwan. And if he gets away with this with respect to Ukraine, somebody else is going to come along looking to do something similar to this in Taiwan. And this is doubly important. And I would just close with that. And I would say to the people of Ukraine, we admire you, respect you, value your leadership of your president, and our prayers are very much with you today and every day. And more than just prayers, a lot of hope and help. With that, anything else from all right, with that, we're adjourned. Thanks so much.